My mission is to teach history through art and to make people think more critically about false narratives. I'm Jim McMurtry, and welcome to my classroom. Today's painting is Indian Encampment on Lake Huron by a man named Paul Kane. He's an interesting guy in that he went out west twice, and the second time for a 3-year period. So he really knew what he was capturing. He really knew what he was sketching because he didn't do the actual oil paintings, of which he had over 100, until he got back to his Toronto studio. So a very prolific painter, and maybe you've heard his name. He was born in Ireland but grew up in Toronto. And that's interesting for me because I too grew up in Toronto. And one of the things that I think is relevant to this series is that Toronto is an Indigenous name. It means trees standing in water. Ontario as well is Indigenous name, and like Toronto, it's Iroquoian from the Iroquois tribe, or Six Nations. They call today the Haudenosaunee. Ontario means sparkling water, and then Canada. So I used to have Toronto, Ontario, Canada when I was going to say down south with Americans didn't really have a very good grasp of Canadian geography. And Canada means village or settlement. So there certainly is an awful lot, of course, in Canada's nomenclature, in our history, in our body politic that has been informed by Indigenous people, and I think that's important. The Iroquois were not always popular. They were originally from Upper New York State. They were given the name by local tribes called the local Algonquins, called the Iroquois, that name because it meant rattlesnake. So they were not. They were known as being very fierce, and they're rivals for a long time. And it came to a head in 1649, and the Iroquois pretty much almost exterminated, decimated the Huron, and there are populations left, but very small, and some as far as they were pushed as far as Quebec City. But the Huron got their name from a French word, which I find interesting, and that it's a word for a wild boar, and that's because wild boars have short, bristly hair on the top of their heads, and that was the style for the Huron. Over time, that ended up being called a Mohawk hairstyle, which was again their bitter enemies. And Mohawk, the word Mohawk, you may be interested in knowing in its origin, means man eater. So I want to make this comment at the end that Canadian history isn't boring if you are open to it. So the extraordinary thing about people like Paul Kane and traveling almost 2 centuries ago, in the 1845 to 1848, which is the principal years of travel for him, is that he created a visual record of our past. There weren't people with cameras that hadn't been developed invented yet. There weren't First Nations. There weren't any people moving about in the Canadian West or North with any ability to record what things looked like, but he did that so artfully and expertly with his crayon sketches and again and time and with his oil paints. So with this particular painting, I don't really think we have inaccuracies, but we do have a false narrative. What I mean by that, with regard first to the inaccuracies, is I think it's a pretty fair rendering. Now, not everything is exact. One thing, the suggestion to us, if it's an Indian settlement, unlike Huron, that these are the Hurons, and these did live as far west as Lake Huron, which is, of course, why it has that name today. But they didn't have conical structures, the teepees that you see here. They were in dome-shaped structures, shelters called wigwams. And so I'm not saying it's an inaccuracy because maybe it was a different group, and maybe because teepees are something that was characteristic of groups that were further to the west. And anyhow, just with you might find it interesting. You can see in the painting that the covering of the teepee isn't. So this is why a little bit of confusion for me because as a teepee it would be animal hides, but it looks like in the painting what surrounds the teepee is is birch bark. And the Huron did use the eastern woodland Indians, First Nations, Indigenous. They did use birch or balsam bark for again for the outside of their structures, their wigwams. On the inside, they put down tree boughs and make it cover themselves and animal furs and so forth. And it was around a fire. They had an open pit fire, and as you can see at the top, rain would get in because there had to be a hole for not only air to get in, but also for the fire to get out. So it wasn't ideal, but obviously it was something that allowed the indigenous people to thrive for thousands of years in this area of Canada, which we call the western around the Great Lakes. Some people call it the Canadian Shield because originally it was a mountain. It was a huge mountain range like the Rockies, but much older, 200 million years old. And so there's been much more erosion. So you have the area just dotted with lakes. In fact, Canada has more lakes because of the Canadian Shield than all other countries in the world combined. I think that's an interesting statistic. In fact, there's something that to me is a bit of a false narrative that when we talk in schools about Indigenous culture and peoples and so forth, is we give the impression that women and men are of equal status, and that's just not true. Although there were certainly groups like the Iroquois that were matrilineal, meaning people's names and privileges and so on were carried through the mother's line. People often matrilocal, meaning that people would go to live with their mother's tribe, and but it wasn't that. You can see in this painting that the women are working, and the men are idle, are lazy, because that's really what it was. Is that men were hunters and women nesters, is to take a line from Seinfeld. Um, but the women also among the domestic duties was caring for the children, and you can see that as well. Particularly, there's a woman inside of a tent, another with a baby on her papoose, and so um, this is the only false narrative that I wanted to talk about today, and that is that I don't think we have any part of the world where it was easy being a woman back in time. But and that's certainly true of in pre-contact Indigenous culture. And there's one grouping in Canada, and they've got a new name today, but they were called the carrier people. And the reason they got that name is that was a name that was given to them, and it was given to them by the Cree, and that's interesting itself because Cree comes from the French word for Christian, chrétien, and so it shows you that a lot of the Indigenous people in Canada were Christian for a long, long time because the first missionaries were in Canada here over 400 years ago. A lot. Again, the first settlement in Canada of any note was Quebec City in 1608, but Port Royal was the actual first established community. Is very small and exists today, but more as a hamlet. And so we've had the influence of the church, and lots of Native people being again Christian for an awfully long time. But the carrier Indians, what they used to do is they'd carry the women when their husband died. They'd carry around his ashes and bones on their back in a bag for 3 years. Now I know that's something that my wife wouldn't agree to do for me, and it was just an interesting observation. You can see as well in the paintings they have canoes, and it's interesting to me the end of the canoe. There's not the handle's a little different. They didn't really have handles. At the end of it, you can the canoes were made of of birch bark at some time. The gun wells, the ash structure was ash. The gun wells were made of ash, and they everything was together or glued together by which was a mixture of pine or spruce, gum, resin, and other things such as charcoal, usually from burned oak and deer fat. So that's how they kept it all together. So they would be very fragile, but by being light, they obviously were very efficient in being able to go long distances quickly. If the painter of this painting, Indian encroachment on Lake Huron, and the specific date I said between 1845 and 1848 to the sketches, we don't really know what specific date is, but sometime in that period, it could even have been a couple of years later before he did it. What the and But what's interesting to me is what if he were to come back today? And of course, things would be very different. He would find farms and place of open prairie. He wouldn't see buffalo herds. He would see roads and towns and all the things that we know of. Something else that he would notice is different. A big grouping of native people to the north of where this painting took place, which we now call the Dene, were back in time called the slaves or Slavies, and that was a name given to them by the Woodland Cree because they were used as slaves, and that's where we get names today, such as Great Slave Lake, which is Canada's biggest lakes, if not the biggest. So you have a lot of people saying to me, and this is teacher for a long time, is that Canadian history isn't very interesting, and I hope, and just looking at this painting and seeing how different the culture was and life was for people back in time, that you wouldn't come to that conclusion, that you would think that it was very different, and that in itself makes it exotic and exquisite and interesting to learn about. So that's it. I would like people to know that Canadian history is not boring, even though it's been picked to the bone recently by political correctness.